So here's the thing with the presidential immunity decision from the US Supreme Court. As a civil rights attorney, at first blush, it made sense. That's because we adopted this legal term called sovereign immunity from the English, and it pretty much means the king can do no wrong, which is very un American of us. We adopted it. We adopted it through statutes and pretty much saying that you can't sue the government with a few exceptions, and there's a bunch of hoops and higher burdens you have to prove compared to a typical civil lawsuit against a private individual. And the basis behind it is you want a functioning government. You don't want it to be sued all the time for nitpicky things and bogged down and be concerned about making a specific decision with being scared of being sued. However, the thing is that doctrine typically just applied to private civil lawsuits. It didn't apply to crimes. So this US Supreme Court decision related to a crime, and there was no precedent as it related to governmental immunity on crimes. What the Supreme Court relied on was this case by Fitzgerald back in 1982 with a lawsuit against President Nixon. And at that point, there had never been a decision on whether or not a president could be absolutely immune from a civil suit. And the Supreme Court there decided that, well, based off the president's functions, he needs absolute immunity from any civil suit, meaning that you can't sue him at all for anything that he does if it's an official act as the president. If he's not acting as president and just acting like a normal citizen, then you could sue that person. And that applied to prosecutors too, applies to judges. They have this absolute immunity where you just can't go to them because of how important their function is. But then the question is now is okay, we've got crimes involved. Should that apply to crimes? And the US Supreme Court said yes, it should extend to crimes under the same principles. The issue with that, and Justice Sotomayor pointed out that in the Constitution, in Article 2, it talks about how you can get removed from office for committing high misdemeanors or felonies. And so in the Constitution itself, it says that you're not technically immune from that. And then also the Senate has that impeachment power. And so it raises question is that really in the Constitution? And the one problem with that is, I mean, it, again, going back to us and the English, that makes us more English. And it allows a president to pretty much get away with whatever he wants to legally. Um, and in some ways, that can be a bad thing because, I mean, legally, he's off the hook, and essentially the law doesn't apply to the president. And should that happen, I mean, if you read the Declaration of Independence, that was a huge issue that we had with all the things that the king was doing, and nobody could get recourse from what the king was doing. Uh, and then it raises the question, I mean, so if a president murders someone or is in a conspiracy to murdering someone, they're just absolutely immune from that. So there's a lot of issues with that principle. On the other hand, though, if they could be charged with crimes, that could be used as a political strong arm against the president on saying, "Hey, you committed these funky misdemeanors that really aren't that relevant, that maybe don't aren't crimes that necessarily affect the nation as a whole. I mean, jaywalking or whatever." So I can see how, on the other hand, we want to protect the president. We don't want the president to be scared of committing actions and having concern about later being prosecuted for them. And there's some weird criminal uh, code crimes where some outside the box thinking prosecutors could try and nail a president on for anything and everything. So we definitely don't want that to happen. But also, do we want a government and president to do whatever they want or have them somewhat be held accountable for their crimes? Either way, my issue is I think that there's nothing necessarily in the Constitution that says that they're absolutely immune from it, and this is just kind of uh, judicial uh, judicial opinions carving out the Constitution or giving a big, broad picture view of the Constitution, which I'm not a big fan of. I'm a fan of looking specifically at the language and saying, okay, is it in the Constitution or is it not? And if it's not in the Constitution, then pass a law on it, have Congress pass a law. But there's issues on the judicial branch writing law instead of saying, hey, this isn't, there's no law, there's nothing to interpret here, so let's pass it off to Congress. So that's the concern, but they did have precedent from the Nixon case to say, hey, these same principles apply. So that's essentially where it's coming from. But what's going to happen now is that uh, they remanded the case, so they sent it back down, and there's still a remaining question on whether or not the president, when he did his actions, was an official act of the president. And that is a loaded issue too, because there's no like clear list in the Constitution that says what the president can and can't do. It does list some presidential powers in there, but there's also some implied powers that necessarily aren't written in the Constitution. There's some powers that Congress has granted to the president, or there's some powers that Congress, uh, by implication, lets the president do because they haven't acted on it. So there's just so many arbitrary and it's eagle. It's there's a lot of argument to say that, oh well, this was an act of the president because of this power. Uh, but what's going to happen now is on remand, they have to decide whether or not what he did was an official act as the president or not. So technically, he's not immune from everything. And maybe you could say that murdering someone isn't a official act of a president. And so I guess there's some leeway there where some illegal actions can never be an official act because they're essentially illegal. How could that be a power from the president if uh, if they're acting against the criminal code? So I guess there is some protection there. So at this point, they still have to decide whether or not it was an official act or not. So we'll see how that goes. But that's, in a nutshell, presidential immunity.